Ever wonder why sermons camp in Hebrews 11, get intense in Hebrews 12, then rush through Hebrews 13 like awkward leftovers? Because Hebrews 13 exposes the forbidden blueprint for real Christian life. What love costs, what leaders deserve obedience, and what it means to leave the safe, respectable camp, and your pastor doesn't want to touch it. Have you ever read Hebrews 13 and thought, this just feels like a random list of rules at the end of the book, and moved on? Most sermons camp in Hebrews 11, get intense in Hebrews 12, and then treat Hebrews 13 like the leftovers. Quick instructions on love, sex, money, leaders, and suffering. But what if I told you this boring chapter actually contains the forbidden blueprint for what real Christian life and real church are supposed to look like? And that's exactly why almost no one teaches it honestly. By the time we're done, you're going to see why Hebrews 13 talks about prisoners, marriage beds, money, abusive leadership, leaving the camp, and praising God when your life is falling apart, all in one chapter. You'll see the hidden pattern that ties it together, and why your faith has felt shallow, controlled, or fragmented when this chapter has been treated like an optional add-on instead of a revelation. Most Christians have never been walked through this. Your pastor probably read pieces of it, skipped the awkward parts, and moved on. But Hebrews 13 quietly exposes the secrets of church life nobody wants to touch. What love costs, what holiness really looks like behind closed doors, what kind of leaders should actually be obeyed, and what it means to follow Jesus when it takes you outside the safe, respectable camp. If you've ever felt like church gave you cliches but not a real way to live, this chapter is going to cut through that. And once you see what's really woven into these verses, you won't be able to unsee it. If you really want to feel the weight of Hebrews 13, you can't start at verse 1. You have to back up one breath. Right before this chapter begins, the writer says, "Therefore let us be grateful for receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken. And thus let us offer to God acceptable worship with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire." Hebrews 12:28-29, a kingdom that cannot be shaken, a God who is a consuming fire. We love to stop right there. It sounds epic, intense, heavenly, but the Holy Spirit doesn't stop. The very next words are, "Let brotherly love continue," so Hebrews 13:1. Do you see it? He goes straight from consuming fire to how you treat people, from unshakable kingdom to your daily life, from awe and reverence to love, hospitality, sex, money, leaders, prisoners, praise. This whole chapter is God saying, you want to know what unshakable kingdom life looks like. You want to know what it means to worship a consuming fire. Watch how it plays out in the way you love, the way you suffer, the way you handle a bed, a bank account at a broken church. This is not a random list tacked onto the end of a deep book. It's the application of everything Hebrews has just exploded in your face. Remember who this was written to. These were Jewish believers who had already suffered for following Jesus. Hebrews 10 says they endured a hard struggle with sufferings, were publicly mocked, had their property seized, and stood side by side with those in prison. Hebrews 10:32-34. They were tired, worn down, tempted to go back to something easier, back to religious routine without the scandal of Jesus at the center. Hebrews 11 reminds them, you're not the first ones to walk through this. Abraham, Moses, Rahab, all the saints who lived and died in faith. Hebrews 12 tells them, you're in a race that God disciplines you as sons. He's shaking what can be shaken, so what cannot be shaken will stand. And then Hebrews 13 says, here's how this actually looks on an ordinary day, and in an ordinary life, in an ordinary church. You've probably heard Christianity preached like this. Have big faith, survive discipline, endure shaking. Now, go be nice to people and try your best. Hebrews 13 refuses to leave it at that. It takes everything lofty and glorious. Jesus as the better sacrifice, better priest, better covenant, better promise, and presses it straight into the most uncomfortable corners of your life. How you treat your brothers and sisters when you're tired, what you do with strangers, what happens in your bedroom, how you hold money, how you respond to leaders, what you do when Jesus leads you outside the safe religious camp. If Hebrews 11 is the hall of faith and Hebrews 12 is the call to endurance, Hebrews 13 is the X-ray of whether any of that has actually reached your heart. That's why it feels so awkward, because it doesn't live in theory. It drills into where your Christianity is either real or just language. And here's the part nobody told you. This chapter is not written to people who are on a spiritual high, and it's written to worn-out believers, people in their equivalent of midlife or later, spiritually speaking. They've seen some things, lost some things, and are wondering how to keep going without becoming bitter, cynical, or fake. Sound familiar? So when Hebrews 13 starts saying, let brotherly love continue, show hospitality, remember those in prison, it isn't handing out extra credit assignments. It's saying, this is what it looks like when the God of Hebrews 1 to 12 has actually gotten hold of you. This is what unshakable kingdom life looks like. In relationships, in suffering, in the parts of your life you've been told are private or off limits. If you've ever thought, I know a lot of Bible, but my life still feels shallow, fragmented, like the pieces don't connect. Hebrews 13 is where those pieces either click together or get exposed. This is why so many churches rush through it. It confronts our comfort and our secrecy, our church culture, our unwillingness to love when it costs our refusal to address sex and money honestly, our unhealthy relationships with leaders and institutions. It's easier to say, Jesus is better, God is a consuming fire, and then skip the part where that consuming fire burns through our fake love, our hidden compromise, our safe religion. But you're listening because some part of you is done with safe if you've lived too long to waste what's left on a version of Christianity that never touches your real life. So if you're willing, we're going to walk through this chapter slowly, command by command, line by dash, and let the Spirit show you what He wanted your church life to look like all along. And it all starts in a place that sounds simple, but almost nobody actually lives what it means to let real, costly, inconvenient love continue. Let brotherly love continue. It sounds so gentle, doesn't it? Like a Hallmark verse for a church foyer. But in Hebrews 13, that line is not soft wallpaper. It's a command dropped into the lives of people who have every reason to shut down. You don't tell people to let love continue unless they're tempted to let love stop. You know what it's like to be tempted to stop. You've loved people who walked away. You've opened your heart to churches that split, gossiped, or used you. You've prayed for folks who never changed, helped people who never said thank you, stood by family who turned on you anyway. After a few decades of that, your heart starts to say, I'll still be kind. I'll still be polite, but I'm done loving like that, and it costs too much. And into that exhaustion, the word says, let brotherly love continue. Hebrews 13:1. Not just friendliness and not just Sunday smiles, brotherly love, love that treats fellow believers as actual family, not consumers, not projects, not people to tolerate until service is over. Romans 12:10 says, love one another with brotherly affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. That's the standard, not put up with each other. Honor, affection, family. So if we're honest, how much of what we call church matches that? We've built services, programs, events, strategies. We've perfected greeting times, refreshment tables, rotations, and rosters. And yet so many believers in their 50s, 60s, 70s will quietly admit, I've been in church all my life, but I've never really felt like I belonged to a spiritual family. The next line in Hebrews 13 blows up our safe version of love. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares. Hebrews 13:2. We think hospitality means a nice foyer team and a coffee station, but in the early church, hospitality looked like strangers at your table, traveling believers in your spare room, risking your safety and reputation, to care for people you barely knew because they belonged to Jesus. It was messy, inconvenient, and sometimes dangerous. That's why the word says, do not neglect to show hospitality. Because when life is hard, money is tight, and you're tired, hospitality is the first thing you quietly drop. Let this confront you gently but honestly. You can attend church for decades and still neglect hospitality. You can say, God bless you, and never share your table. And you can pray for the lost, but never sit across from one with a meal between you. You can love your church and never let a lonely believer or a hurting stranger into your actual home, your actual space. The word says some have entertained angels unawares. In other words, when you open your door to the ones who seem least impressive, least powerful, least worth it. Heaven pays attention, yet you have no idea who you are really welcoming when you welcome the least. And then the command gets even more costly. Remember those who are in prison, as though in prison with them, and those who are mistreated, since you also are in the body. Hebrews 13:3, as though in prison with them. Not say a quick prayer, not post a verse and move on. Remember them, like you were there yourself. Feel their chains on your wrists and feel their isolation in your bones. This was written when following Jesus could literally put you behind bars. The temptation was huge. Don't associate too closely with prisoners. It might cost you, it might mark you. Keep your distance. Hebrews says the opposite. Draw close. Act like their suffering is your suffering. Because spiritually you also are in the body. One body, one pain, one story. Now bring that into your world. We may not, in your context, have many believers in literal prison for their faith, but we do have brothers and sisters who are bound in other ways. The one crushed by chronic illness, slowly losing strength and mobility. The one trapped in addiction, fighting the same battle again and again. The one stuck in a nursing home, forgotten by almost everyone. The one in a broken marriage that feels like a cell. The one battling depression and anxiety, trauma. To remember them as though in prison with them is to refuse to let them suffer in silence. And it looks like phone calls, visits, meals, rides, texts, presents, -- not because you can fix it, but because you refuse to leave them alone in it. If you are 45, 55, 65 plus, and you've walked with God for years, this is where Hebrews 13 presses you the hardest. Have you quietly settled into a safe spectator version of church? Have you let brotherly love continue only within cozy, familiar circles? Have you neglected hospitality because opening your life feels invasive, exposing, too risky? Have you remembered the suffering as if you were right there with them, or have you backed away because their pain scares you or drains you? This isn't condemnation, it's invitation. God is saying, you asked me what real Christian life looks like, and here it is. Love that doesn't quit.